Welcome back, guys, to another episode of Almost Well Versed. If it's your first time here, welcome. This is a book podcast where I usually talk about books. Well, really, stories. I should expand and say I talk about stories, not just books. Thank you guys for tuning in again this week. I know I say it every week, but thank you to all of my listeners out there. I love getting feedback from you guys. I love talking to you about all the different books that I've been doing, getting episode ideas. It's really been a lot of fun working on this podcast and learning each week new things. And I feel like it's fun to have a project that you're passionate about and get to learn more things all the time. You know what I mean? But anyway, thank you guys for all your lovely feedback for last episode. I know Anthony really enjoyed being back on the podcast, and I really enjoyed having him back too. And I know I was talking to some of you guys, and we're going to try to do Saga a little more consistently, like not have as big of a gap in between episodes, just so, the story stays fresh in your head since it is an ongoing thing. But even though I say all that, I'm not talking about Saga this week. We're talking about completely different. We're switching gears, guys. We've talked about young A novels. We've talked about mystery novels. I did a video game, but this week, guys, we're switching it up. We're doing some horror satire. Ooh, should be exciting. But I'm just gonna jump right in, y'all. So the book I'm talking about this week is called Lullaby by Chuck Palahniuk, and you might recognize that name because he is the guy who also wrote Fight Club. If you've ever read the book or seen the pretty famous movie. I know Fight Club was kind of the big book that he's known for, but dude has written a lot. He's not on Brandon Sanderson level, but he does have a good amount of novels out there. And his whole thing is kind of if you're familiar with Fight Club, he's into satire, tackling social norms and things like that. So Lullaby kind of falls into that same category, but yeah, it was originally published back in 2002, and this was his second big novel that he did. And the thing that I did like about Lullaby is even though the story gets really nuts, the book is not long at all. I think I read through this book in 2.5, 3 days. So if you're interested in reading it and picking it up, it's not a big commitment. I want to say it's maybe 300 pages, probably not even 300, but it gets wild. So so saying all that, just kind of setting it up, let's just jump right into the story, right? So this novel, it follows a dude named Carl Streator. And so he's a middle-aged dude, he's a reporter for a newspaper. He's been a reporter pretty much all his life, right? And so he is writing a 5-part series for his newspaper covering sudden infant death syndrome. You may have also known of this being referred to as SIDS. And so pretty much what SIDS is just if you're a child that's under the age of 1 that just suddenly dies for no apparent reason, it wasn't smothered or you know what I mean, just mysteriously dead for no apparent reason. Medical professionals usually will categorize that as sudden infant death syndrome. It happens sometimes. They don't really have an answer for it. And because of that, it can kind of be scary, right? So his idea is to write this 5-part series about SIDS to get readers hooked, to tune back in each week to see the next part, And so Carl, he has a paramedic friend, this dude named Nash, and he tells Nash about him writing the story. And so one day randomly Nash hits him up and was like, hey, we got a call from some parents about their suddenly dead baby if you want to accompany me to the scene of the crime, right? And so, Carl, he meets Nash over there, and sure enough, they're examining the baby, and there's no signs of trauma, not bleeding, nothing, just mysteriously dead, right? But Carl, he's looking around and he notices an open book on the nightstand next to the crib, and this book is open to page 27, right? And the book is called Poems and Rhymes from Around the World. he doesn't really think anything of it, but I mean, he's a reporter, right? So like his whole thing is he's trying to look for the details, right? So he just kind of takes note of this book that was on the nightstand, and sure enough, like I said, there was no signs of trauma for the baby, so they're just gonna say that it was another SIDS case. So Carl, he heads home from the crime scene, but on his way home he stops and like picks up some package, and you're probably thinking the worst, but it was nothing bad. Homeboy was just picking up, like, he's into building miniature models. Okay, so he just gets a miniature model. And so he goes home and he like is weirdly obsessive about building this model. So like he gets everything set up and is sitting there and like painting all the little pieces and gluing the whole thing together. And you can usually tell in books, right, when there's some like monotonous thing going on, you're like, oh, we're going to get a little bit of monologue from the main character, right? And sure enough, we do get a little bit of monologue. So Carl, he's pretty much just, I don't know, he's kind of bitter. He's kind of a bitter guy. He's just like thinking to himself about how loud, I wish you could see my quotations, how loud the world is. How people are trying to fill the void with noise. That can be literal noise, like, TVs, your, traffic noises, your light bulbs buzzing, or like metaphorical noise, like hobbies or affairs or, things like that, right? For him, you learn that his void is the fact that his wife and his baby died some years ago with no warning. Like, they just kind of died mysteriously. And since that happened, right, so he moved out of that town and changed his name and pretty much tried to like start a new life to forget about it. But I mean, you can't really forget something like that, Obviously, he's still hurt about it, as he should be, right? That was his wife and his kid. He finishes putting this model together. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with models, but like, them bitches, you can't just do that in one sitting, usually. You know what I mean? Like, you gotta paint all the pieces, and it's like it's like, think of a puzzle. It's like a 3D puzzle, pretty much. You know what I mean? And so, homeboy, he puts the whole thing together in one night. And, so like by the time he's done, it's like 3 a.m. and he puts it in the middle of the floor and he's looking at his beautiful work. Like, yeah, I did such a good job. And then he just takes his shoes off and then just stomps the model to smithereens. Just literally just pounds it into the ground. And you're just like, oh, right. Homeboy is obviously not dealing with his problems well, okay? But whatever. So a couple days go by and Carl, he gets another phone call from his Nash friend about another SIDS case. So Carl goes and he meets Nash over at the crime scene, and sure enough, when they're looking around in the nursery, that same book is on the nightstand, that Poems and Rhymes from Around the World. And so he like picks the book up and puts it on its spine so it'll just fall open to whatever the last page open was, and it opens to the same page that was open on that first night. And he's like, okay, this is strange. He takes note of this poem or lullaby or whatever. He takes a note of it and he like makes a mental note, like, I'm gonna check this book out from the library so I can like, see what's in it. And like as the days go on, him working on the story, it's like day after day after day, he's getting calls from Nash about these suddenly dead infants, right? And here's the thing with SIDS, right? Like, it does happen, but it's not super, super common. It's common enough to where, like, if it happens, it's not like the police are going to investigate into, see if, like, you killed your child or something, but, like, it doesn't happen every day. And so they're getting a lot of SIDS calls, and Carl's like, this is a little strange. And so then, like, the fourth call that he gets, when he gets to the crime scene and meets up with Nash, the dead child is actually like 6 years old. And the key thing to know about SIDS, right, it's sudden infant death syndrome. They usually will use that to categorize undetermined deaths for children up to the age of 1. And then once the baby is older than 1, any death would just be considered undetermined. And so Carl like takes note of this because he's like, 6-year-olds don't just die, like it's not like he was like suffocated. He's just dead and nobody knows why. The next call that he gets from Nash, like that 5th call he gets when he gets to the crime scene, This is the first time that he didn't see the book present, because all these other calls he's been getting, when he checks out the nursery, sure enough, that same book is in the nursery. But this 5th call, there is no book there. And so he asks the parents, he was like, hey, have you checked out anything from the library recently? You know, I'm a reporter, blah, blah. And they were like, yeah, we did, but somebody from social services came by this morning to like pick up some clothes to take it down to the station, I guess, for sampling to see if, you know, whatever, investigating. And also took back some overdue library books that they had. And he's like, why would a social worker take your overdue library books? That's kind of strange. So the next day, Carl, he goes and he meets up with some realtor named Helen Hoover Boyle. And so you're like, okay, is homeboy like trying to buy a house or something? But no, he pretended that he's interested in seeing a house because he just wants to talk to this lady. And you as the reader, you're like, why does he want to just talk to this random lady, right? But so he meets her there at this house that she's gonna show him. And here's the thing about Helen, right? So like, she's super made up. Like, she's got the big hair that's hairsprayed, always in like pantsuits, and her nails are done, and she has like lots of rings and big old earrings. And Carl is like, this lady is doing a lot, but whatever. But so he meets up with Helen at this house, and the whole time that they're touring the house, she's just on her phone with her secretary, like not even paying attention to him. He's like, lady, why did we meet at this house if you're not even going to talk to me? But she's just going on and on with her secretary about, she's like pissed about some other customer that she had, these like newlyweds that bought an old historical house from her, and they're talking about wanting to tear it down, and Helen is pissed because it's a historical house and blah blah. And Carl's like, lady, I don't care about this newlywed couple or whatever, like I'm just trying to talk to you, right? He tries to like give her some time to like get off the phone, but obviously she's not. So he kind of like gets her attention and mouths to her that he's a reporter and he like has some questions for her. And so for the first time, the whole time that they've been there, she kind of like puts her hand over the speaker on the phone so she can actually talk to him. And he was like, hey, you know, I'm doing research for a story that I'm writing for my paper, and I want to know if you have a child that died from crib death 20 years ago. And she's like, excuse me? And he was like, yeah, you know, did you happen to read aloud to him from a book? Did the coroner's office actually do an autopsy on the body? And he's kind of like just rattling off these like really personal questions to her. And Helen was just like, excuse me? But he tells her that he's asking because he gets the idea that he wants to destroy all the copies of this book. You know, he's working on a theory here, and he doesn't want this book to gain notoriety. But as he's trying to explain himself to her, Helen just she just starts getting her shit together and was just like, I'm out of here. And he's like, what? And she was like, get out. Like, I'm not talking to you. So he was like, all right. So he just books it out of there. But even though Helen didn't answer any of his questions, he still heads down to the library to see can he check out this book. And sure enough, the book has been returned. And the last person that had it checked out was that last family that he visited with Nash. So he checks out the book and opens it to that page 27 and copies the poem or lullaby or whatever that is on that page. And in the book, it's described as a culling song. And so here's the thing about a culling song, right? It's technically a lullaby, but it would be a song or like a poem that you would sing to somebody that you hope dies soon. So pretty much like a mercy killing. Like, you know, think someone who's deathly ill or like a wounded soldier. You would sing the song to them to like ease their pain, to help ease them into death, to stop their suffering. You know what I mean? So Carl, he heads back down to the news station, you know, to give an update to his editor about how the story is going. And Carl tells his editor about this theory he has. He's like, okay, man, it's going to sound kind of far-fetched, but I think that parents are reading this poem out loud to their kids, and the poem is killing them. And the editor is just like, what? Like, what? Are you saying there's magic? Like, get the fuck out of here, right? And Carl was like, man, like, give me a chance, okay? Like, let's read the poem. Like, let me read it out loud, and we can, like, try it out. And if nothing happens, then we know that I'm lying. And the editor is like, okay. So Carl, he pulls out his copy of the poem, and he reads it, and then they're kind of sitting there for, like, a minute, kind of just, like, twiddling their thumbs, and they're like, well, nothing happened, so I guess my theory was wrong. And the editor was like, well, I guess I'll just see you tomorrow at work then. And Carl's like, all right, man. So, they call it a night. They go home for the night. But then Carl, he comes back for work the next day, and everyone is asking him, like, oh, have you spoken to the editor? Like, he hasn't come into work yet. He was supposed to be here 3 hours ago, and we have a big piece that we need to run. And they're calling the editor's phone, and he's not answering. And Carl just goes to his office and sits down, and he's like, oh, shit. I killed my editor. I killed my editor, and this culling song is killing babies. Like, hello? But then he's thinking, and he's freaking out because he just killed his editor, right? But he's also freaking out because he's like, what if people start realizing that this culling song actually kills people? Like, how many people would die if the general public figured out that there's a culling song that can kill people, right? Like, how many people would be dying both intentionally and unintentionally? And Carl is like, he's thinking worst case scenario. Like, what if somebody played this song, like, over a loudspeaker, or, like, over the speakers at a sporting event? Like, say people go out to a baseball game and someone just says the poem on the microphone and the whole stadium hears it. You know what I mean? Like, it would be catastrophe if people figured out this song. And so before he can even, like, start to formulate a plan of, like, what he wants to do, he gets a call from that paramedic friend, that Nash dude. And Nash tells him, hey, even though it's not a SIDS case, we got a call about a newlywed couple that was found dead in their hotel room. And Carl was like, wait, tell me more. And Nash was like, yeah, there was no signs of trauma, and they've been there, like, they were on their honeymoon apparently, and yeah, they were just found dead by housekeeping in the morning. And so Carl was like, okay, hang on, let me come down there. So Carl, he jumps in his car, and he meets Nash down at the hotel. And sure enough, there was no signs of trauma, like, there's no blood, there's no drugs, there's no alcohol. And Carl, when he sees this, he immediately thinks of the culling song. He was like, somebody read this, either they read it or somebody read it to them. Like, what else would just randomly have a newlywed couple dead, right? And Carl, he does a little digging, like, he finds a homeboy's cell phone, and the last person that they spoke to on the phone was, you can guess it, that Helen Hoover Boyle lady, the realtor. And Carl was like, okay, hang on, wait. I need to talk to this Helen lady again. So he heads down to her realtor office and pretty much, like, flat out accuses her of, like, reading the culling song over the phone to that couple, because if you remember, she was complaining to her secretary about a newlywed couple that wanted to tear down some historical house, and then the next day a newlywed couple is found dead. Like, that's a little too convenient, right? But then Helen was pretty much just like, she never, like, admits to knowing the song, to reading it to them, but pretty much says, like, hey man, like, in the grand scheme of things, does it really matter how two schmucks died? Like, they were gonna die eventually anyway, And Carl is just like, no, like, that's not okay, man. But Helen, she does kind of admit to her child dying mysteriously some 20 years ago. And then a year later, her husband turns up dead mysteriously as well. And Carl's like, okay, you're doing a lot, Helen. I don't know what you're doing, but you're doing a lot. And I need to find all the copies of this book and destroy them, because people just can't know about this song. Like, this is bad news for everybody, right? So Carl is like, see you later. He heads back to the newsroom and finds out that apparently they found his editor dead in his apartment. And Carl is just like, oh shit, this is bad. But so the second in command, like, whatever the editor's assistant or whatever, he, I guess, chain of command, is technically now the head boss. And so second in command is, like, not talking shit to Carl, but, like, trying to get him to do stuff he doesn't want to do. And he's just talking, and Carl is just getting more and more mad because Carl's preoccupied, right? Like, he's got other stuff going on. And the dude is just going on. And then pretty much what happens is Carl, like, unconsciously thinks of the culling song. And it kind of just, like, he thinks through it so fast, like, it just rattles through his brain so fast, he doesn't even realize that what he's thinking is that culling song until he's done with it. And he realizes, oh man, I memorized the poem on accident. Just from the couple of times that he had read through it, he memorized it. And he's like, oh man, now my second in command editor, he's about to turn up dead tomorrow. I can't keep having people die around me, man. Like, this is bad. But he, so he just kind of books it out of work. He's like, I can't be at work right now. Like, I'm not stable. I can't be thinking this culling song randomly killing all my coworkers. Like, I need to get out of here, right? So Carl, he goes home and, like, gets in the shower, right? Trying to calm down. And while he's in the shower, all he can hear is his neighbor above him is playing, like, super loud ass music. And I guess, maybe having a party or something. Like, he just hears, like, thumping and, whatever. Just a lot of loud, obnoxious noise from his neighbor upstairs. And sure enough, he thinks the poem again. And he's like, ah, shit, I don't want to kill my neighbor. Right? But it's too late. It's already gone. It came and went. The poem is done. And sure enough, when he wakes up the next morning, there's some mysterious spot growing on his ceiling that you can pretty much assume is blood, right? And he's like, this is not good. But yeah, so pretty much what's happening, right? Since he accidentally memorized this poem, like, instead of, like, when someone makes him mad, like, instead of in your head being like, oh, like, fuck that guy or whatever, like, he just thinks the culling song. And then they die. Like, hello? What is happening? So he is kind of freaking out because he's like, obviously I am not stable. I am not okay enough to be around people knowing this song. So he goes back to Helen. He's like, okay, Helen, look, we didn't get off on the right foot, right? But, like, you need to tell me how you have been able to live all this time, not just randomly killing people with the culling song, right? And Helen was like, well, I still don't want to talk to you, man. Like, hello? But Carl was like, okay, look, hypothetically speaking, what if I had a wife and a child that died mysteriously 20 years ago, similar to her situation? Like, what should he do? Right? And so he did some research and found out that the book, that poems, what was it called? Poems and Rhymes from Around the World. It was originally printed about 20 years ago, but it was a really limited print. There was only like 500 copies or so. And the person that owned the rights to that book actually died like 3 years ago. So, he's a reporter. So he's trying to think big, right? He's like, if I can get the rights to this book, then I'll see everywhere it was printed, I'll stop it from ever being printed again, and then I can find all the existing books and rip this poem out of it, pretty much, And so he's telling this to Helen, and Helen was like, well, here's the thing, man. That guy died 3 years ago, and as soon as he died, I bought the rights to the book and found and burned 300 of the 500 copies of the book. And Carl was like, damn, girl, like, you've been doing a lot. You've been doing a lot. But here's the thing about Helen. She's not really interested in destroying the books for the greater good. Like, she doesn't give a shit if people know about the culling song. What she is interested in is finding the original book that this poem came from. Because obviously it's like a collection type book. So she wants to know, where did homeboy find the poem? Like, what book did he find the poem in? That's what she wants, because she's curious to see, like, okay, if there's a culling spell or a culling song in there that obviously works, what other kind of poems or spells are out there, And so she refers to, like, that OG book, as the Book of Shadows. That's colloquially what you would call, like, a collection of spells or whatever. So she's looking for this original Book of Shadows, and the secretary, Mona girl, she, like, overhears them talking about, like, a Book of Shadows, and she was like, hey, man, like, surprise, like, I'm kind of into witchcraft. Like, she's like a wannabe witch, pretty much, and has like it's like a whole thing. She has like a coven, and they have like, monthly witch meetings and all this shit. And she was like, hey, like, we're actually having a meeting tonight if you want to come to the meeting and see if anybody like knows anything about this Book of Shadows. And so Carl kind of looks at Helen and was like, maybe we should check it out, right? And Helen is like, I'm not trying to... Witches, come on, man. Like, that's poppycock. But Carl is like, okay, if there is a culling song that exists, who's to say that witches can't exist? You know what I mean? So, like, maybe we should go check it out. So he gets Helen to agree, and that night they go to this coven meeting, right? It's at Mona's apartment, and it's just a bunch of, you can imagine what this meeting would look like. A bunch of hippies, and they're naked, and it's a whole thing. What do you expect? But Carl's pissed because they sit through this whole bogus ass meeting and don't learn anything. They don't get any new information. Nobody knows about this Book of Shadows. Nobody knows about some apparent culling song that really exists. And so Carl's kind of bummed, man. The only thing they learn from this meeting, is they meet Mona's boyfriend, some dude named Oyster. He's a witch. Come on, guys. But yeah, and the thing about Oyster is he's kind of an asshole. Like, he's super, like, self-absorbed, and, like, he's really pretentious, and is always, like, talking mad shit to Carl, and Carl's over here just trying not to think of the culling song to kill this rando dude on accident, right? Like, Carl, he's going through a lot. But they meet Oyster there, and the only other good thing that happens out of this meeting is Carl and Helen, they kind of come to an understanding with each other, right? They're like, okay, we both have dead spouses and babies, and we're both trying to find this book, even though we kind of have different ulterior motives. So maybe we should, like, team up, pretty much, right? So that's what they do. They decide to, like, go on a cross-country road trip looking for all the books so they can destroy the poem out of the books, right? So this book kind of went from, like, a character narrative about a reporter, like, living with the guilt of, like, having a dead spouse and baby to, like, a black comedy almost. This bizarro black comedy about Carl trying to, like, not think about this culling song killing people, but, like, they're on some grand quest to find all these books. It gets crazy. We're already escalating. But here's the thing about this road trip, right? Mona kind of invites herself. And then with Mona being there, of course, Oyster is going to accompany her. Like, that's her boyfriend, right? So now it's the four of them. We've got Carl, we've got Helen, Mona, and her asshole boyfriend, Oyster. And they're just all in Helen's car. And they're just driving around, right? But here's the thing, right? Helen has the rights to the book. So she has, like, a grand list of all the locations of where this book is, like all the libraries and stuff that this book is in, right? She has, like, this giant planner that has a grand old list of all the book locations and everywhere the book has ever been checked out and yada yada. She's got a system, okay? And Carl is like, this is a lot. So, yeah, they're just kind of driving around, like, going city to city, state to state, and they're just visiting library after library, finding the book, and then just ripping out the one page, that page 27 or whatever, and destroying it. Usually, like, burning it up, so, you can't... Because, think, if you rip it up, people are going to try to put it back together, right? So, they either will burn it or, like, tear it up and flush it down the toilet, or, like, actually making sure it gets destroyed. But then it's funny because in the cases where if they get to a library and find out that the book has been checked out, then they have to go to the house of whoever checked that book out, right? And so to get in the house, Helen and Carl, they kind of pose as traveling salesmen, right? So, like, either she'll pretend to be, like, a makeup artist, like selling makeup, or he'll pretend to be, like, an evangelist, like, coming in, he wants to talk to you about God, like, any way they can, like, finagle their way into the house, and then one of them will be like, oh, can I go use your bathroom, while the other person keeps the owner occupied, and then they'll go look, and usually they'll find, like, an empty nursery with that book, and then they'll just rip the page out, and then just book it out of there, right? So they're traveling around, and I mean, they're kind of doing okay. Like, they're kind of making a good time. They are finding like a lot of copies of the book and are able to pull out that page 27 and destroy it. But like, as time goes on, or as their trip goes on, Oyster is becoming more and more insistent that Helen and Carl show him the poem that they keep destroying. Like, he wants to know. He's like, okay, if me and Mona are driving cross country with y'all, like, the least you could do is show us the poem that you're destroying. And Helen and Carl are like, hell no, like, we're not letting you see this because, first of all, you're an asshole. So like, you would probably use it for asshole ways, okay? And we don't need that. So no. But Oyster, that kind of pisses him off. Like, he's kind of, it's a slow boil. Like, he's just slowly getting more and more mad as time goes on, right? You find out that Helen's son isn't dead. So remember whenever Carl had rolled up to her and they were speaking in hypotheticals, like, what if, and Helen admitted to having a son named Patrick, and that Patrick isn't dead and buried somewhere, but that she has him like cryogenically frozen in a medical center. And you find that her motivation for finding this Book of Shadows, this original book or whatever, is because she believes that if there's a song in there or a poem in there that can kill people, then the inverse must also be true, right? Like, there has to be like a resurrection spell in there. And she's trying to bring her baby back. And you're like, oh, okay, Helen. But it's funny because as the road trip keeps going, Carl is just kind of getting worse and worse at being able to control himself about like unconsciously thinking the culling spell. So at this point, he's like anybody like pisses him off is getting killed. So like for example, like they're listening to the radio, and there's some like radio preacher man on the radio that's just kind of talking loud and whatever, and Carl gets pissed and then just thinks the song, and then the guy is dead. Or like they turn the station and then there's some like annoying talk show hosts on there, and they're just blathering on about whatever, and Carl, he just like can't stand it anymore, and then thinks the song, and then like the radio will like cut because they're dead. And Carl is like, this is getting out of control, guys. Like, we need to figure something out. And he wants to know. He's like, Helen, how are you able to exist without just like randomly killing people? Like, she's known about this culling song for however long, like however many years, and people aren't just randomly dying around her. But he finds out, like, he's kind of looking at her planner or whatever, and there's like a bunch of names written in there. There's just like a bunch of random names written in there, and then like a type of jewelry or like a type of stone written by it. And he's like, what is this all about, right? And he realizes that Helen, she uses the culling song kind of like how an assassin would. So like people will call her up because they want somebody dead, like, whoever, some political leader or somebody overseas or whatever. They'll call her up, to kill whoever, and as payment she asks for these like rare jewels. So that's why she was wearing all this crazy jewelry, because she's just like mad rich in jewels. Her thinking is there's no way to like trace jewels the same way that you could trace money. So whoever it is that's hiring her to kill somebody, there's no way to trace it back to either of them, right? And her rationale is, if you intentionally kill somebody, you won't unconsciously think the song and kill people. And Carl is like, I mean, on paper that sounds right, but so you're just like some assassin? Hello? Like, what? But as the road trip continues, like on the radio, they keep hearing news stories about like random fashion models turning up dead, and neither Carl nor Helen would have any motive for killing fashion models. So they're both kind of like, who is killing these fashion models? And the thing is, kind of like in all these other cases, all the fashion models, when they turn up dead, there's no signs of trauma. Like, they're just dead. And Carl can't really explain it, but he kind of has a feeling that his paramedic friend Nash has something to do with this, right? Because in all the cases where it was something like SIDS related, it was always Nash was the one there. And then I didn't say it earlier, but whenever they found that newlywed couple dead and Carl and Nash were in the room like before all the other paramedics got there. Nash was kind of like, he was like weirdly talking about how like attractive the dead lady was, and how interesting it would be to like have her one more time before they take her body away. And Carl is like, dude, that's nasty. Like, get out of here with that. Like, don't even talk to me about that, right? But thinking of that, Carl is like, why else would a bunch of fashion models just be turning up dead, right, in their city? And it's gross. That is so, that's nasty. But I mean, it's just a theory, so Carl can't really do anything about it, right? So they continue their trip, and if you can't tell by this book, things are just slowly escalating, right? So like they end up in some town that had 3 copies of the book. Like there was one store that was supposed to have 3 copies of this book. And so Helen and Oyster, they go to buy them or find them so they can rip the page out or whatever. But when they get to the bookstore, they realize that it's kind of like a thrift store type, like a Ed McKay, where apparently nothing in the store was shelved correctly. Like everything was misshelved. And they're like, well, this is a giant bookstore with, possibly thousands of books in it. How are we going to find these 3 books, right? And so Oyster gets the idea. He was like, we should just burn the building down. And Helen was like, all right. So they just burned this whole bookstore down to the ground because they couldn't find 3 books. And Carl is like, okay, guys, like we're doing a lot. Like what we're dealing with is a lot, but like y'all are doing a lot. Like you didn't have to burn down a whole building. And Helen was like, well, what did you expect us to do? Like there was no way to go through a whole building to find 3 books, So that happened. And then like the next stop on their road trip, they end up at a person's house that had the book checked out. And it was like a single guy like answers the door. And so Carl and Helen, they pretend to be missionaries so they can get in the house. And, Carl is like, pretend to be a missionary. He's like, I'd like to tell you about our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And, oh, also, can my wife use your bathroom? And the guy is just like, first of all, it's like the afternoon, and homeboy is like chugging beer, which is whatever. You can day drink, but homeboy is like obviously dealing with something. And second of all, his house is like weirdly empty. Carl notices. And so he's like, hey, can my wife use your bathroom? And homeboy was like, all right. So Helen, she scuttles off to go and try to find the book. And Carl is trying to like, he's got to keep up his front. He's got to pretend to be a missionary. So he's like, trying to talk about the love and grace and forgiveness of God. And the guy kind of just cuts him off and was like, hey, I'm not trying to hear your Jesus shit pretty much, because I've got to go to court in 2 days because his baby turned up dead mysteriously, and his wife went to the cops and said that he killed the child. And how can you explain God being around when something like that happens, right? And Carl was just kind of like, I'm sorry, like, my bad. But hearing this story, Carl like kind of has a breakdown about it, because up until this point we don't really the book doesn't super go into Carl's backstory, like other than the fact that that his wife and his child died mysteriously, but you don't know anything leading up to that or anything after that other than the fact that he left and changed his name, right? In his breakdown or whatever, you learn that the day that his wife and his daughter died, that he was home with them, right? Like, and when he woke up in the morning, he didn't realize that they were dead already. Because like when he checked on his daughter and like kissed his wife, they were still warm. So like they hadn't been dead for very long. And whenever he had woken up and like rolled over to kiss his wife, and sometimes you like want a little morning sex, and so he has sex with his dead wife and didn't realize that she was dead. And then when he comes home from work that day and like sees the wife and the daughter in the same spot that he left them in, he realizes like, oh my God, what did I do? And in the autopsy report, they had to report that there was post-mortem sexual intercourse that happened and this pretty much ruined his life, right? And so that's why he had to move away and like change his name, because you can't come back from that, right? No, you can't come back from that. My God. But yeah, so some days go by, like they continue on their trek across the country looking for these books. And Carl's pager has been blowing up this whole time. It's been blowing up with some number that he doesn't recognize. So like, why would he call it, right? But finally, his phone is blowing up, or the pager is blowing up. And he's like, okay, fine. So he calls the number, and it turns out to be a detective, right? And this detective is like, hey, I'm Detective so-and-so from his original city, whatever city they're from, and was like, so there's all of these models showing up dead, and we'd like you to come in for questioning, right? And Carl is like, can you tell me if these models have had if they have signs of like postmortem sex? And the detective is like, well, you know, I can't really disclose anything over the phone to you, but we'd really like you to come in for questioning so we don't have to issue a warrant. And the whole time the detective is just talking, and all Carl is thinking about is like, okay, number one, they have my number, because obviously on file it's gonna have in there that he was involved in a case with postmortem sexual intercourse, right? Bad. But two, you know, he knows that it's not him and Helen involved, so the only other person would be Nash. So like, Nash is just kind of like on a rampage almost of just killing all these attractive women and then doing whatever and then leaving them, right? Oh, and not to mention the fact that his editor is dead, and then his neighbor is dead, and then the second in command is dead. So he's kind of leaving, like, imagine how you would leave a paper trail. He's kind of leaving a body trail, right? And the detective is like, hey man, like, we need you to come in willingly, or, you know, we're not afraid to issue a warrant. But Carl just kind of hangs up on him. He just hangs up on him, but he thinks the culling spell, like, of course, he thinks that culling spell, and, you know, we can all assume that officer dies. But, so, Carl is getting a little worried. He's getting a little worried because he's like, okay, obviously people are out looking for me, but even though I have been killing people, I haven't been killing those models. Like, let's not get it twisted, right? But before he can even, you know, do anything about that, he goes back to the car and meets back up with the crew, and Helen, she's also coming back to the car with her latest copy of the spell that she got out of the book. And, you know, they're just kind of talking, and Helen's like, you know, however many down, 50 more to go, and goes to light the page on fire to burn it. But then, like, as soon as it catches fire on the corner, Oyster kind of sneaks up behind her and, like, kicks her feet out from under her, like, knocking her to the ground. And he snatches the poem out of her hand before it can, like, fully catch on fire. And he pats it out real quick. And everyone's kind of grabbing at him because they're like, no, don't let Oyster read it. Don't let him read it. Because, like, who is he gonna kill, right? So Oyster, he's able to, like, read it real quick. And he's like, haha, I got your poem. Now you can't hide from me anymore, pretty much. And Helen is so angry. Like, Helen is pissed because not only did he, like, knock her over and now she's bleeding, but what is he gonna do with this poem? Like, Oyster can't have it, right? So Mona is just crying this whole time. She's like, please Helen, don't kill him. He didn't mean it. Like, he's harmless, blah, blah. But Helen is like, she's fuming. Like, she's so mad. And, like, she has the car keys in her hand because she's about to get back in the car. And she, like, slaps Oyster across the face, pretty much, like, keying his face. And so then he falls to the ground and he's bleeding everywhere. And, you know, Carl is like, Helen, like, don't kill this kid. Like, don't do it. But she looks at Oyster, and then she looks at Carl, and then one by one, birds start dropping out of the sky dead. It was like a whole flock of birds flying overhead. And Helen just killed this flock of birds so she doesn't accidentally kill Oyster. And as Carl is just like, whew, we dodged that bullet. Because there's no way we could hide this body. If she would have killed him, right? Pretty much for Helen, there's no coming back from that. So she pretty much tells Oyster to get out. She's like, you're not getting back in my car, homie. Like, you can do whatever you're gonna do, but not with me. And so Oyster was like, fine, whatever. Like, I don't care about you. So come on, Mona, let's go. And Mona is just like, she's still crying, and she's looking at Helen and Carl, and then looks over at Oyster, but she's like, you know what, man? I can't go with you. You're doing crazy. You're being crazy, man. Like, I can't. And Oyster was like, fine, well, fuck you too then, pretty much. And then he just kind of leaves on his own. And, yeah, so now we're minus one from the crew. Oyster, he's gone. And, the three that are left, so Helen and Carl and Mona, they all get back in the car and they continue on with their trip, but things were kind of heated that day. They did not have the best of days, so, they decide to make a little detour to some carnival. There's always little, like, town fairs or whatever, some little carnival. They go to the carnival and, play a couple games. They, like, get some cotton candy, whatever. Carl's like, hey, Helen, we should, like, ride this Ferris wheel. Like, this will be fun. So they they get on the Ferris wheel, and, they give Mona all their stuff to hold because, you can't take stuff up on the Ferris wheel with you. So they get up on the Ferris wheel, and they kind of have a nice little moment. Like, it's not really like, don't think that this is a love story, because it's not. But, there's a camaraderie going on between them, right? So, like, he kind of, like, holds her hand a little bit, and they're like, oh, this is nice. Like, I haven't touched anybody else in, like, 20 years. They both have dead spouses and, like, never came back from that, really, So while they're on the Ferris wheel, Mona, like I said, she's holding all their stuff, and she realizes that the planner that Helen's been using, this big planner, this planner is actually the Book of Shadows they've been looking for the whole time? Like, hello? So, like, apparently whenever Helen got the rights to the book, those 3 years ago, she, like, went to the property because there was a bunch of books at the homeboy's property, and there was just this random book, like, sitting on the counter, and she's like, man, this is a nice book. I'm gonna take it, and takes it, but she didn't realize that that the cover of this book is made out of human skin. Okay, gross. Number 2, that it wasn't a blank book, it's that the book it's completely written in invisible ink. And you're just like, okay. But also number 3, not only is it invisible ink, but it's, like, written in multiple languages. So, like, you've got some Latin, you've got some Greek, you've got some Hebrew, you've got some English, like, a bunch of different languages. And Mona, she's telling Helen, like, hey, man, we found the Book of Shadows. Like, you had it the whole time. We already know that we have one poem that came out of this book, the culling song, and we can use that as a key to translate, like, the rest of the book, right? Like, of course, that makes so much sense. But Helen was like, yeah, that is a good idea, but you can't see the culling song, so therefore I have to be the one to translate it. And Mona's kind of mad, because she was like, but I was the one who figured out that this book was the Book of Shadows. It's not my fault that you've been carrying around this book for 3 years and didn't realize that it was the Book of Shadows. Like, you should at least give me the liberty of translating it. But Helen was like, I'm sorry, man, like, you can't. Nobody else can see this culling song. Like, me and Carl already knowing it is, like, 2 people too many. You know what I mean? Like, we don't need and Oyster knows it now, too. We don't need a 4th unstable person knowing this culling song. And so, Mona's hurt. Mona's pretty hurt about it, because she feels slighted. And I mean, rightfully so, but Helen does have a point, right? Like, people don't need to be knowing this culling song, right? So, now that they have the Book of Shadows, Helen's like, well, pretty much fuck our quest. Like, we don't need to find all the rest of the books anymore. Like, I got my Book of Shadows. Like, let's go home, right? And so Carl was like, I mean, I still think we should find the rest of the books, but I have some loose ends I need to tie up back home. So, yeah, let's, like, head back to the crib. So they go back home. Like, they kind of just, like, abandon their quest. They go back home, and Helen, she pretty much obsesses over the book, figuring out how to translate it. And surprisingly, she's making a lot of progress. Like, she's able to translate, like, a good amount of stuff out of this book. She discovers there's a flying spell. There's supposedly a love spell in there. She found, like, the original culling song, or the culling poem or whatever. Carl, he goes to check in on her, a couple days later, and of course, when he walks in the door to the realty place, Mona, she's still pissed. She's still super pissed at both of them. But Carl, he walks into Helen's office and notices a newspaper sitting on the counter, or on the desk. So he opens it up to the first page to see, they haven't been home in some undescribed amount of time, at least some days, probably some weeks, right? So he just wants to see what's going on in the news. But he flips it open to like the first page, and then he realizes that it's a full page ad, and it's a picture of his old wedding picture. So it's the old picture of him and his wife, and pretty much the ad is just saying like, hey, if you see this man, call the police, he is dangerous. And immediately Carl is like, man, that was Oyster. Like, Oyster's out here trying to bot me. Like, hello? But at the same time, he realizes that Mona is on the phone, and so he listens, and homegirl is like calling the cops, telling the cops that Carl is there. And Carl is just like, man, what is happening to me? Like, why are these kiddos over here trying to ruin my life, pretty much, But Helen was like, hey man, like, you need to leave before the cops can get here, because of course they're gonna arrest you. Carl's like, it's not like I can go home. Like, my neighbor is dead. They're probably looking for me there. And so Helen's like, okay, go and hide out in that first house we met in, like that all the way back when they first met up. And so Carl was like, all right. So Carl heads over to that house, but he is not having a good time. Carl is having the worst of times. He's kind of losing it here. He can't stop thinking about all the lives that were ruined because of this culling song. His life included, him, Helen, all these other people's houses that they were going to find the song. Like, all these people's lives ruined because of this song, or this poem, or whatever. And the fact that, like I said, it's not like he can go home because the police are definitely going to look for him there. It's not like he can go back to work because he killed both of his bosses, and the police are probably also looking for him there. And so he just kind of feels stuck, right? He's like, what am I supposed to do? So that night, Helen goes to the house to meet up with him. She shows him the book, like all the work that she's been doing, translating all these spells, right? She shows him that she fully translated this flying spell. And Carl's like, okay, a flying spell? Come on, man. You expect me to believe that? But so she reads it, like she reads through it, and then slowly but surely she starts floating up. And then slowly but surely he starts floating up, and he's like, oh shit, I can't fly. And so they're just kind of floating in the air, and he's like tangled up in the chandelier, and he's like, get me down from here. And all the while, Helen is still holding onto the book, and she's still chanting, whatever kind of spell. Carl says, he turns to her and was like, I feel like I'm falling in love with you. Like, maybe it's the proximity. Like, maybe it's because I haven't been near another female in, like 20 plus years, but I kind of feel like I'm falling in love with you. And Helen responds to him, yeah, that's the point. And so in your head, you're like, oh shit, is she reading a love spell? Like, does a love spell exist? Regardless of a love spell or not, they end up having sex on the ceiling, like in the chandelier. And the whole time they're doing the do, Carl is like, yeah, I'm pretty sure that she said a love spell, but it's not like there's anything he can do about it, right? Like, if you're under a love spell, like, that's it. You're just in love until they get rid of the spell or whatever, So that happens, whatever. And so then the next day, Carl is like, all right, we got to finish some things, right? Nash, I got to go confront Nash because he's doing a lot. Like, he can't just keep going around killing all these models, right? So Carl, he calls 911, and he was like, hey, I'm going to be at this bar, and if you could I'm on my way to this bar, and if you have a guy named Nash there, send him as the emergency medical tech, but don't send anybody else. Only send Nash. And the 911 operator is like, hello? But Carl hangs up and heads to the bar. And so he finally gets there, and he walks in, and when he opens the door, he realizes that every other person, well, let me say, he sees Nash sitting like in a booth by himself, and he's like eating a bowl of chili, but he realizes that every other person in the bar is dead. All the other patrons, the waitresses, the cook, everybody else is dead. Except for Nash. And Nash is just like, kind of just like, what's up, homie? Like, what's going on, man? Like, I'm surprised it took you so long to realize that it was me. And Carl was just like, man, you can't just go around killing people. Like, did you really think that this was sustainable, pretty much? Like, did you think that you could do this forever and nobody would realize that it was you? And the whole time, Nash is like, whatever. Like, he's just sitting there eating his bowl of chili. And Carl is like, Okay, here's the real question. How did you find a copy of the poem if I personally destroyed like all the poems that are within 100 miles of our city or whatever? And Nash was just like, well, I went to the one place where I knew that you couldn't destroy it, and that's at the Library of Congress. Library of Congress like has a copy of every print that's ever been printed. So yeah, that's where I got it from. And I wrote it down on a little index card and I just keep it in my pocket. And Carl is like, you are literally a crazy person. Like, you can't just go around and kill models and then have sex with them and then expect nobody to think it was you. And Nash is just like, well, here's the thing, man. If you kill me, it'll be like killing yourself because, we both had sex with a dead person and I just happen to really enjoy it. And at this point, Carl is so done. He's so done and disgusted and he's just over it. But then before he can do anything, he sees Nash pulling out the index card from his pocket and he starts reading his copy of the culling spell. And you're like, oh no, is he about to kill Carl too? But here's the thing, before he can even get to the end of the poem of like reading it out loud, Carl thinks the whole thing in the time it takes Homeboy to read the poem. He thinks it so fast that before Nash can even get to the end of the poem, he's dead. He just drops into his bowl of chili, sending chili everywhere. And Carl just reaches over and then takes his copy of the poem and lights it on fire. And he calls the police on himself, pretty much. He was like, hey, he calls 911 and was like, hey, come to this bar at the corner of whatever and whatever. I'll be sitting here waiting for you. And he really did. He really did sit there and wait and get arrested because at this point, he's done. Like, he's like, obviously, I can't just be out and about in life because I have the knowledge of this song and I'll just keep killing people. So what's the one place I can go that I have like minimal interaction with people? Prison. So he lets himself get arrested. He gets taken down to the station and he gets processed and, they always give you your one phone call. So he calls like the only person that he knows / can trust. He calls Helen and pretty much tells her what happened. That it was his paramedic friend that been killing all those models and that he killed Nash and that he was done. She has the Book of Shadows now, so she can do whatever she wants. If she wants to try to resurrect her kid, whatever. But, I'm going to prison. I'll see you later. And so he's like getting processed to go into jail or whatever. And as you always see in shows and in the movies, they have to do a cavity search on you, right? And so the officer is like, all right, I'm going to need you to bend over and spread those cheeks. And Carl is like, oh no. And so then literally when the cop has a literal finger in his ass, the cop like leans over and whispers in his ear, hey, do you have time for a quickie? And Carl is like, what? No, like this is the worst thing that could happen to me right now, right? And so he's like begging, he's like, please officer, like just let me go. Like you can do anything else to me, but not that. Like please don't do that to me. And then the cop starts laughing and was like, just kidding, it's me, Helen. And Carl is like, what? Helen? What? And Helen was like, yeah. She translated what's called an occupation spell out of the book, where you can pretty much take over a person's body, like kind of think of like a Hulk situation, where you can take over a person's body and you just shove down that person into their subconscious to where you can't, or they're not in control anymore. You're in control. And so Helen took control of this officer so she can break him out. And Carl is just like, what is my life? What is my life? But, yeah, he was like, he looks at her and was like, hey, like, even though you saved me out of this prison situation, I can't actually love you because I don't know what's real and what's not. Like, you could have casted a love spell on me. You know what I mean? Like, sure, I'll say the right things or I'll act infatuated with you, but like, just know deep down in my heart, it's not real. And when he tells Helen this, it really hurts Helen's feelings because she was kind of feeling him, like she kind of felt like they were two peas in a pod. Like they had very similar backgrounds and wanted similar things and were similarly jaded. And so when he tells all this to her, she's upset. She starts crying and was just like, get out of here. I told the guards that I'm letting you go. So just get out of my face. So Carl does. He leaves, and he gets the idea that he wants to grab this Book of Shadows because he wants to see what other kind of spells she's been working on, right? So Carl, he gets all his stuff back, and he heads down to Helen's office. When he pulls up, the door is locked, and he sees Mona standing outside. But here's the thing about Mona, right? So whenever Helen had figured out this occupation spell, she took control of Mona for a couple hours and just completely gave her a makeover. So Mona looks like how she looks. Like with the super big hair and the gaudy makeup and the gaudy jewels and pantsuit and everything. And so Mona, she's so mad. She's so mad because, I mean, I know I didn't say it earlier, but I mean, if you can just imagine that if homegirl says that she's a witch, she probably has like dreads and like, you know, whatever. She probably looked like a hippie before. And so now she looks like super cookie cutter realtor. So she's angry. But so Carl is like, where's Helen? Like, did she come back? You know, kind of like go back to her body or whatever. But Mona just tells him, hey, you know, you just missed Helen. She came back, but she gave me the Book of Shadows because she was so upset. She was crying and she was shaking, and she pretty much seemed like she was about to do something desperate. So like, you should probably go find her. And Carl was just like, what do you mean something desperate? And Mona was like, well, she mentioned something about going to visit the medical center, so you should probably go check there first. And Carl is just like, okay. So Mona, she gets in the car, and he's like, where are you going? And she was like, well, I'm out of here, man. Like, obviously Helen doesn't want me around anymore. I can't get behind this culling song situation, so like, I'm out of here. As she's driving away, Carl, he notices Oyster in the back seat. And he was like, is he dead? Because he's not moving. But at that point, Mona's already gone. So it's not like he got a solid answer about it. So Carl, he hops in the car and he's already thinking worst case scenario. He's like, what is Helen doing? Right? Like, she's kind of going off the rails here. So he heads down to the medical center. And he heads up to the floor that he knows where Helen's baby is being kept frozen or whatever. And as the elevator door opens, he looks out on the floor and he sees all these nurses are dead and there's broken glass everywhere, and then there's like a trail of blood leading into the room, and Carl is just like, what is happening, man? So he steps over all this glass and he pushes open the door to get into the baby's room. He sees Helen standing in there. She's just kind of standing there, and she's just got her hands on the little tank or whatever that the baby is being held in. And Carl calls out to her. He's like, Helen, what are you doing? Like, what is happening? And she turns and looks at him, and she's just covered in blood, her own blood and probably other people's blood, who knows? But he notices that her mouth is just steadily bleeding. Like, it's just a lot of blood is coming out of her mouth. And she starts talking to him, and he realizes that like all her teeth are broken, and that she starts telling him that pretty much like she couldn't live with what she was doing anymore, and she didn't want any of these jewels anymore that she's been getting as payment. So like, she tried to break them all, but like some of them were too hard to break, and you know, so then she got the idea to chew them up, and so that's why she's bleeding. And then Carl's just kind of looking around. He's so confused, and he's looking around, and then he sees like a bottle of drain cleaner on the floor that's open and empty, and he's like, oh no, what are you doing, Helen? Like, what are you doing? And so she tells him that she unplugged the life support and the battery from her baby Patrick because she doesn't want to bring him into a world where the culling song exists. And so the only logical explanation is for them to die together. Carl, at this point, he doesn't know what to do. He's like, what are you doing? What is my life? So he goes over to the tank where baby Patrick is being held, and he punches it open and pulls the baby out and hands it to her. So she's sitting here covered in blood. She's got no teeth. She drank drain cleaner, and she's holding her dead frozen baby. She's crying, and then he starts crying, and he's like, you know, I'll just hold you until you're gone. And then as he gets down on the floor to sit next to her, Helen like looks over at him and pretty much says like, gotcha, bitch. And turns out that it was Oyster. So Oyster had gone back to the realty office and saw Helen's body like passed out on the desk for whenever she was doing the occupation spell controlling that officer whenever she saved Carl. And so he saw what page the book was open to and saw that it was the occupation spell. So what does he do? He says it and occupies Helen's body, because he was like, of course he's the bad guy, right? So he starts monologuing, and he was like, you really think that Helen would be like so upset over a culling song that she would commit suicide? Like, are you dumb? Right? And Carl is hurt. Carl is so hurt. He was like, what are you doing? Like, what? You just murdered somebody? Like, what? And so Oyster pretty much says, like, good luck trying to find me and Mona, because we've got the book now. Quote unquote Helen, aka Oyster, gave it to Mona. So now we've got it, and we're just gonna live life how we want, right? And then vacates Helen's body. And so Helen, she comes back to her consciousness, and, you know, she's been possessed, I guess. She's been possessed this whole time by someone else, so she doesn't know what's going on. So when she comes back to, she's looking around, and she's so confused, and she's like, why am I hurting? Like, where are my teeth? Why am I bleeding? Like, oh my God, am I holding my dead baby? Like, what is happening? And she's freaking out, and at this point, it's been some time, so, you know, that drain cleaner is probably killing her from the inside, and she's just holding her stomach in pain, and she just can't. She's just crying and so hurt. She's like, Carl, like, help me. Like, what is happening? And Carl, he looking at her, and he doesn't know what to do about the situation. And then he gets the idea to do the one thing he knows how to do. He says the culling spell for her to end her suffering, right? And so he says it, killing Helen. And he sits there holding her for some time, just thinking about everything that's transpired. And he's laying there with her long enough that the baby actually starts bleeding from thawing out. Like, that's how long he was there, right? But then he hears, like, some glass starts crunching, so, like, you know, obviously someone else is there. And so he looks over and sees an officer walking in, and he's like, oh shit, like, here we go, arrest me for real this time. Like, I'm going to prison. Okay, I'm going to prison. And the officer, like, walks up to him and holds out a note. And so Carl takes the note and he opens it and he reads it and realizes that it's a suicide note that's written in Helen's handwriting. And he's like, hello? And so he looks up, realizes that it's that same officer that Helen was controlling at the police station. I guess what happened is, since Helen's body died, there was nowhere for Helen's consciousness to go back to. So she's kind of stuck in this sergeant's body. And so Helen looks at Carl and was like, come on, man, like, let's get out of here. Let's get out of here before other police start showing up. Like, leave that note and that'll tie up this loose end, and, like, let's book it. And so Carl, he gets up and they just leave dead Helen and dead baby Patrick there on the ground, and they get out of there. And so Carl and Helen, they're just like, well, I guess we gotta find Oyster, right? Like, we don't know what they're gonna do with this book now that they have the Book of Shadows. And so they, like, get in the police car and they start driving off. And Helen pretty much is just telling him, like, all the spells that she's translated. Like, even though it's bad, right, that Oyster and Mona have the Book of Shadows, it's not the worst thing, because most of the spells that she translated were kind of useless. Like, she translated, like, a rain spell. There's, like, a fertility spell. One where you can, like, communicate with animals. There's that flying spell. Of course, the occupation spell. She actually tells him that, hey, I actually didn't find a love spell in there. So whatever kind of feelings you were having for me, those were your feelings. Like, that wasn't projected, right? Carl is just kind of like, well, I guess this is my life now, right? And so, yeah, so Carl and Helen / the sergeant, they head off on, like, another cross-country trip, just trying to follow the signs of bizarro things happening, looking for Mona and Oyster. They can't really ever settle down anywhere because, you know, Carl's pretty much a fugitive, and Helen is stuck in this sergeant's body, so they're just like, well, let's just drive. And that's the end. Like, what? Oh, gosh, guys. I don't know what this was. This book was a lot. Here's the thing. This book is short, but, like, things get weird. They get a little weird. I debated with myself for a while if I wanted to talk about this book because of the graphic nature of some of it, but it was just too bizarre to not share with you guys. Like, And here's the thing, right? This Chuck Palahniuk, he's kind of what you would consider like one of these cult writers. Like, people either love him or they hate him, right? So this Lullaby book, it has like decent reviews around. Like, it got a 3.7 out of 5 on Goodreads. It got a 4.4 out of 5 on Amazon. But it's like, but if you go and read people's reviews of the book, a lot of people are super turned off with the whole, dead people thing and having sex with them. Like, that is a lot. Like, don't get me wrong, that is a lot. But for me, it was just so bizarre, this experience of a book. Like, it just completely shifts gears on what it is and just becomes like this weird black comedy about the main character not trying to accidentally kill people, but he's like rolling with somebody who like intentionally kills people and is like a hired assassin almost. And then the whole fact that Helen gets stuck in the sergeant's body, and then now he kind of feels obligated to stay with her, and then they're trying to find Mona and Oyster. Like, what did this book become? I don't know. Oh, it just kind of goes off the rails, right? But yeah, so that was Lullaby. Before I go, though, I do want to share with you some interesting backstory that I found out for this novel. So apparently Chuck Palahniuk, he has a crazy life story, okay? So, like I said, this book came out in 2002, right? So, in 1999, Chuck's dad, some guy named Fred, he started dating a lady named Donna, and this Donna lady had just come out of like a long abusive relationship with her ex-husband. And so, like, whenever they first started seeing each other, Donna was straight up with Fred and was like, hey, I just got out of this abusive relationship. She actually was the reason why the ex-husband got sent to prison on abuse charges. And here's the thing, whenever the ex-husband whenever he got sentenced, he said, like, in the courtroom full of people, mind you, this is real life, this isn't the book. The ex-husband says in the courtroom full of all these people, when I get out of prison, I am going to kill you, okay? And Donna was just like, okay, whatever, like, you're going to be in jail for a long, long time, right? So she had moved away by then, and then that's when she met Fred, and they started dating or whatever. And so they were seeing each other for a minute, and then sure enough, when the couple years go by and the ex-husband gets out of prison, he finds Donna and sees that she's with this Fred dude and follows them home from like a date one night and like breaks into their apartment, and he shoots Fred in the stomach with a shotgun. He strangles Donna, and then he sets the whole apartment building on fire. Okay. And when the police catch him, the police want Chuck to be he's a key witness, right? Like, he's a key witness in this situation, and the police want to put him on the panel that's going to decide on whether the ex-husband receives the death penalty or if he just receives life in prison. And at this point in his life, Chuck, he was an investigative reporter at this time. Like, before he became an author, he was more of like an investigative reporter. And so because of that, he kind of he didn't know where he stood on like capital punishment. But the thing is, this situation was so close to him. Like, this was his father that just got murdered in cold blood, right? And so he didn't know which direction he wanted to go with the decision. So he kind of used writing Lullaby as his way of working through how he felt about what had happened and about how he felt about capital punishment. And so Lullaby was just kind of more of like a thought experiment for him. And so whenever he actually does release and publish Lullaby out in 2002, you find out that the month after Lullaby comes out, that the ex-husband was found guilty of 2 charges of first-degree murder and was actually sentenced to the death penalty. So you can assume that using Lullaby as a thought experiment, Chuck, apparently figured out how he felt about capital punishment and voted in favor of the death penalty for this guy. And, yeah. So that was just a little aside. I just thought it's terrible. Like, it sounds so far-fetched to be something that actually happened, but I mean, we've all seen the Aaron Hernandez documentary on Netflix. Like, we've all seen these crazy murder documentaries that are out. Like, this, it really happens, right? But I just thought it was so interesting, Chuck using writing, like, pretty much as a way to work through his thoughts. And regardless of, I feel like, of the subject matter that goes on in Lullaby, it's still really interesting having the backstory in mind while reading it, because, I mean, it's fucked. It's all messed up. Like, the book is, the situation that caused him to write it, it's all fucked. But I don't know. I just thought it was pretty interesting that he was able to turn this terrible situation into a book that's pretty well renowned, and the fact that it actually did win an award. In 2003, it won the Pacific Northwest Bestsellers Association Award. Like, even though it was a tragic life event that happened, and the story of Lullaby is tragic, at least there was some good that came out of it, you know? At least. That's the least that could happen for Chuck. He's had a rough time, okay? But yeah. So that was Lullaby. Let me know what you guys thought. I know this was kind of a lot. Let me know how you felt about it. Was it too jarring? Was it too graphic? I mean, it was a lot. If you, like I said at the beginning, if you know Fight Club does some weird shit. So I knew that going in, but, you know, let me know. Do you want me to stick to more of the mystery type or keep doing whatever? I just felt like this would be interesting to talk to you guys about, because it's weird. It's weird. Some weird stuff happens. But yeah, guys, I know I say it every week, but please like me on Instagram. Follow me on Instagram. I'm just almost well versed. Check me out on Twitter. I've been trying to keep up with some memes on Twitter recently. That's AWV Podcast. Like me on Facebook. My Facebook page is growing a little bit. That's exciting. And make sure to share with your friends, guys. Here's the thing. Podcasts can only grow if you guys tell other people. I only know so many people. You got to share it. If you like it, share it. And if they like it, then they'll share it. And everybody will know more. They'll know more books, right? Isn't that how it works? But thanks again for tuning in, guys. Love you guys. I'll see you next time. Bye.